Why are Gen Zers the most digitally connected generation, yet the loneliest?
It's a great question and the paradox that sits at the heart of this generation. And as we look at this, we think a lot about this concept of visibility and what it means to be visible in today's society, right? When you read the headlines about Gen Z, there's now 70,000 new articles every single day on Gen Z, which is in itself just a mind-blowing concept, but it is the most visible and talked about generation ever. But it's also the least understood. And part of that is that like we're constantly being asked questions of ourselves. Technology or these tools have made it easier than ever to connect with one another, but the actual behaviors and understanding it takes to connect and to do those things are things you have to learn by yourself and independently. And so it creates this really vastly growing paradox of being super connected and continuously connected, but also still lonely. And that is continuing on the other end of the spectrum too.
You are listening to Personalization Outbreak, a podcast about the collapse of traditional corporate standards in today's more personalized world. I'm Llopis. I'm a leadership strategist, author, contributor to Forbes, and founder of the Leadership in the Age of Personalization movement. On this show, I'm interviewing executives across multiple sectors to find out how the balance between standardization and personalization can exist. Hello, everyone. Welcome back to Personalization Outbreak Podcast. I'm often asked, what in the world is leadership in the age of personalization? It's really simple. It's about helping people achieve at their fullest capacity while being seen in their full humanity and dignity. Have you ever felt that you've been missing your dignity for a while? Well, why is this so important? Because since we were born, our lives have been predefined by us. We're born. Hopefully, we go to school, get good grades. Then we go to college, get a job, contribute to something meaningful. And then what happens? We don't. Why? Because when we enter the workplace, we're told what to do inside the box we're given. This is extraordinarily limiting. It suppresses us, and we quickly lose our sense of identity, of who we are, what we stand for, and we quickly lose our purpose for existence and belonging. And we wonder why nobody knows anybody anymore. Well, because we have been creating work environments that promote exclusion, not inclusion, that promote sameness, not difference. We're humans, for goodness sakes, yet we're treated like we're widgets. So where do you start this whole process? By fixing the environment, the individual, or both? Technically, it's both. But before we start that process, we actually need to self-reflect, because engaging in the never-ending process of learning, relearning, unlearning, and repeat takes time, because we're rewiring ourselves to reclaim who we are. I've got a special guest for you today, and his name is Andrew Roth. And he's going to take us through a journey of understanding what these topics mean, how they're impacting not just the workplace, but our lives in general. See, Andrew is the founder and CEO of DCDX, a Gen Z research and strategy firm that works alongside some of the world's top brands like Spotify, Chipotle, Crocs, and many more to help them attract Gen Z talent. In fact, did you know that most recently, DCDX found that over half of Gen Z workers prioritize workplace etiquette over authenticity, with an additional 27% stating that they are mostly their authentic selves, but will choose professionalism when needed. See, these findings point to a disconnect between Gen Z values and how other generations perceive them. So before we get started, please click the like button below, share it with your colleagues, and subscribe to our social media and YouTube channels at Llopis. Andrew, welcome to the show. It's great to have you. I know I was fired up about our last call, but I'm glad you're here today.
Yeah, thank you, Glenn, so much. Excited to be here and continue our conversation from the last call.
Absolutely. Let's get into it. So, Andrew, why did you get into this business? I mean, like, why does it matter to you? I mean, you obviously represent the Gen Z community. Are you trying to help create a greater level of awareness so that this generation doesn't get stuck, as I call it, into the standardization traps, much like my generation did? I mean, why are you in this business?
Yeah, it's a great question. I mean, and first of all, I myself am a Gen Zer, right? I'm
Yeah, I
I'm
know. Yeah,
25.
it's like
Yeah, I'm 25. I recently graduated school and have been, part of looking and listening to this world of Gen Z since the day I was born. And I think when COVID happened in 2020, it was really a time for me to step back and reflect and understand like what role do I want to play in the future my generation has. And I think for me, in looking out in this landscape, it's not always the most positive one. It's framed around mental health, a lot of the challenges around loneliness and connection, and what I wanted for me, but also for my peers and for everyone, is to give our generation and the next generation a better and more human life. This world has been completely focused on, technology and all these great things that help us do so many great things as a species and humanity, but also they remove us from who we are and who we want to be. And so that's been a lot of my focus in the last couple of years in starting this and helping to bring organizations into a better understanding of what it means to be a Gen Zer and how we behave and what it takes to really attract us, whether it's in the consumer marketing landscape or even organizationally and into the workplace.
okay, watch this, watch this. And by the way, I admire what you're doing and I'm proud of you. But this reminds me, if I go way back, 10, let's see, 15, I think it's been 18 years now. By the way, I'm Hispanic. So back then, I mean, I wasn't even in the workplace. I was doing this work. But what did I see? Diversity, equity. Well, actually, it wasn't even back then. Back then, it was just diversity. And they told me, apparently, that to get to know me, people needed to know my cultural identity before knowing me. And there was a lot of work done, cultural competency. Heck, they still do it today. And I'm not saying it's bad, it's a good thing, but it's not the strategy, it's a good tactic. And now here you are, 18 years later, doing the same thing, just packaged differently for a generation that has been associated with another set of identities. And see, this is where I think you're going to break the mold because where's my point? Standardization loves putting everything in boxes and labels. And I know you talk about that. We're going to get to it. But why am I jumping into this already? Because listen to what you said. I'm here basically to be an advocate, to help awaken people to understand who this generation is. And yet, here's a generation that doesn't want to be controlled by anybody. And yet we're told that your generation is, the least sophisticated, the ones that don't like structure, that want freedom. What is the point? And I want to riff with you on this for a bit. We've created a society full of judgment without even knowing anybody. And now they have to hire you to get to know someone. But shouldn't technically they should be doing that on their own? Or is this another form of standardization that wants to learn from you and then manipulate and control people based on what they've learned? What's your take on this?
I think it's a little bit of both, right? Like you see on one end where we grew up with algorithms and AI in this world where we are the product, right? We've been the product where advertisers have, monopolized and capitalized our attention and our eyeballs. And that in that world, it's a world where we're fighting back and we're resistant and where there was just a lawsuit against Meta and Instagram for the role they played in our addiction and our upbringing. And that's one side of things. On the other side, there's a genuine interest and curiosity in bringing young people to the table to understand not just what is different, but most importantly, how and why, right? Why is it so different? Why is Gen Z different than other generations? It's not because of the life stage traits that are shared among so many different age groups as they grow up, but there are certain things that make us particularly unique as young people today in today's world. And that's what we really focus on and understanding what makes those things different and how do we help people understand those because those are the new things, right? Those are the things that people are most resistant to hearing. Change is always scary, especially when it's increasingly fast, right? Our name DCDX is literally a reference to the increasing rate of cultural change.
Hmm.
It's a geeky, nerdy derivative reference. But point being, like, change is happening more and more quickly. And so people are increasingly out of touch, but also increasingly fearful that they'll be more out of touch. So what we're trying to do is just help them bridge that gap and understand what is different and why.
I love that. I'd like for you to finish this sentence.
Okay.
Organizations oftentimes see difference, but yet they're not willing to accept that difference in the face of resistance because
Because it's scary. Because because it requires asking yourself questions about who you are and what you understand. And that's a scary thing to do. And people in positions of power that are required to do that are most of the time have never either done that before or not in a position where they're willing to take that step to learn. And that's scary.
you know what's interesting about this, Andrew, and I love that. Great job. They should hire you right away. And why is this so true? Because just the other day, in the work I do, I was doing a basically a 360 with the VP. Not that that matters, but you'll see what happened. And when I did this, this person started crying right there. But why did they cry? Because they hadn't had a discussion like this. No one ever had a discussion that made it about themselves because it's always about the business, not the individual. So when you hear me share that story, what is your response?
I mean, I think it's unfortunate that it's a it's a conversation that kind of ended that way, but I think it's one that needs to continue to happen, right? Like those are the realizations that I think people need to start having to realize the place that we are in culture in today.
Keep going, keep going. That's good.
Yeah.
And why
Yeah,
is that?
I think that like why we need to have more of those conversations. What?
Yeah, yeah,
Yeah.
exactly.
Yeah, I mean, again, people I think it's really important that we're able to like bring similarity, bring our differences into a way of understanding that helps people like use those to make change happen, right? Like today differences are so polarizing and so um it's a you versus me mentality. And I think what we need to have the type of conversations that end in a way that people understand, like they're emotionally affecting, right? And that people understand like the how those differences, how those changes are not just like affecting are not just making your life worse or better, that they're collectively like impacting all of us and how our understanding of that situation needs to evolve to make it a collaborative process, right? Like that's I think that feels like what the takeaway was of that is that they came to the realization that it's not just them, it's like this where it's us, and that in order to get there, we have to lead with that perspective.
Beautifully put, which what you're doing here is helping us understand that, in business, we oftentimes think about the intellectual things, the things that we're going to create efficiency with and drive that predictiveness, obviously, market share, money, all those things. I think what people are starting to realize that while that is super important, we have to have just as much awareness of how people feel
Hmm.
because how they feel actually impacts the ability to do the other side of the ledger.
Oh yeah.
So with this in mind, why are Gen Zers the most digitally connected generation, yet the loneliest?
Yeah. Yeah. It's a great question and the paradox that sits at the heart of this generation. And as we look at this, we think a lot about this concept of visibility and what it means to be visible in today's society, right? When you read the headlines about Gen Z, there's now 70,000 new articles every single day on Gen Z, which is in itself just a mind-blowing concept, but it is the most visible and talked about generation ever, but it's also the least understood. And part of that is that like we're constantly being asked questions of ourselves as young people, it's almost like there's a mirror that's constantly up 24/7 in your face, right? You go to social media and you're having to construct your identity. You're going to dating apps and you're having to build a profile of who you are without even understanding that. And we're constantly having this lens and mirror put back into our faces, asking us questions of who we are before we know that ourselves. And that creates a lot of these paradoxical results where like we're asked to confront these things without knowing the answers. And so, um, when you talk about being the most digitally connected and also the loneliest, like technology or these tools have made it easier than ever to connect with one another. But the actual behaviors and understanding it takes to connect and to do those things are things you have to learn by yourself and independently. And so it creates this really vastly growing paradox of being super connected and continuously connected, but also still lonely. And that is continuing on the other end of the spectrum too.
Andrew, you know, you just revealed
What's that?
that VP I was talking to you about felt very alone.
Oh yeah.
And so I share this because we actually think that's a Gen Z thing when it's a
Right.
everywhere thing.
Right.
The difference is your generation made us aware of the isolation. My generation, for the life of them, never wanted to bring it up.
Yeah.
And one can make all these reasons as to why, but it's one very simple one. When we don't feel seen or known at our truest, how
Right.
can you feel as if you're connected and not just connected, and I'm not talking digitally connected? How can you create a sense of authentic and genuine involvement with anything? It's all
Right.
artificial.
Of course.
Anyway, that's where you took me. Keep going.
Yeah, no, and it's exactly right. And that concept of feeling seen and heard, which is so important, there's a falseness to which that exists in society today,
Mm.
where because of your likes you're getting on LinkedIn and your swipe ups you're getting on your Instagram story, like it it almost it satisfies that to an extent, but it doesn't fulfill it, right? And so like you're left in this constant state of like satisfaction enough but not fulfillment, and you're left with this gap in where you really need to be to feel fulfilled versus what is continuing to kind of get you through the day, right? Like these quick hits of dopamine that continuously feeds you, but the real serotonin that comes from connection and being around people that care about you physically, like really emotionally, that's missing, right? And so like but it's the dopamine that continues to get you through those ups and downs. And so it's really that dangerous disconnect that I think obviously everyone, to your point, is living in, but most adeptly Gen Zers are existing in, and it's what we grew up in, and that's why some of these challenges are most present in this generation.
So, based on what you've learned about your generation, what can you teach my generation, the Xers and others, about it to help them grapple with something that they oftentimes haven't had to be confronted with at all? Because just assimilating, I guess, is the best way to suppress yourself and deal with reality, while your generation wants to confront it and do something about it.
Right, right. Yeah, I mean, we always say, I know it feels easy, but the answer is to listen, to truly listen and bring young people in, like whether that's going outside of your home from your son, your daughter, your child to their friend, to their peers, to people in your community, like talk to young people to experience and understand what it is they're feeling and saying, right? And like it goes beyond social media. And I know that it's again it's the easiness and the convenience of it that I think is the most dangerous distraction. Like what we see on social media is just the loudest voices, but they're not all of the voices, and they're certainly not the majority, right? And so what we need to do to truly understand this generation is to get to the average person, to get to the people like you and me that are sitting here on the other end scrolling while the people are posting, right? We're the scrollers are the ones that are really making society what it is today. And so
Hmm.
how do we do that? We need to talk to them. Right? We need to understand them. And that's not going to come from just like scrolling on your TikTok feed to say you understand young people by knowing the trends that are happening. You need to get truly inside the lives of them. You need to understand their mindsets and their moods and their behaviors, what wakes them up in the morning, what are they scared of when they're going to sleep at night. Those are the things that matter most to understanding this generation and to really empathizing with them.
Take us into the mind of the average Gen Zer.
And I say average, just obviously Gen Z is a very diverse and
No, I'm just using that because it's not the
sure.
one that scrolls the most. I mean, just take us
Right.
into the mind. Yeah, please don't misunderstand that. Go
Yeah,
for
yeah,
it.
no, I appreciate that. I mean, I think there's one of the recent pieces of research we've done to really understand like the mindset, what it means to be a Gen Zer today, what it is to exist in this mindset. Uh, for so long, our generation has been referred to as digital natives, right? We are the generation that grew up with technology at our fingertips. We were born, natives to technology, natives to this digital world. What we did in a piece of research that came out late last year was we said that actually doesn't really describe what it means to be a Gen Zer today. It's just a descriptor of people that were born in an era. What it truly means is not digital natives, but digital captives,
By the
right?
way, that's a great report. Share it, please continue.
Yeah, yeah.
Fantastic.
I thank you. Yeah, it's one of our favorites, and I think it just so well articulates simply what it means to what is the mindset of a Gen Zer today. And it's this idea of that, you know, we call it from digital natives to digital captives, how the internet changed Gen Z. And it's all about this promise of connection that we were given is really a life of connectivity. And those two things are vastly different. And so what it
Mm.
means to be a digital captive today means we're constantly scrolling to numb our emotions. We're constantly like there's some really unfortunate stats in that research that show just how many young people are actually like scrolling not to feel like to feel less, right? They're scrolling to mute their emotions. They're scrolling to kind of be absorbed by the world of technology, not have to dive into their emotions. There's habituations that are happening where we're changing our routines on a daily basis to make sure there's technology spaces and places that fit into those. There's sleep patterns that are getting affected by all this. I mean, it's a constant it's a complete and constant reframing of what it means to exist in this world, and it's all controlled by our digital native, lifestyles. It's truly a captivity to these digital environments, and so it's I think it's a lens that we've been looking at this generation through, and that lens has really helped us to see Gen Z very differently, and it helps us to when you look at some of the trends that have happened in the last 6 to 12 months around kind of this resurgence to IRL, right? These membership communities, the third place kind of resurging, all these different things. You could call it in one end what happens to every generation when they grow up and they decide, hey, I'm going to go leave my room and go talk to people. Or through this lens, you look at it as kind of a fight back, right? You look at it as like, okay, this is my attempt to escape captivity. This is my attempt to remove myself from the barriers that have been placed around me from these digital structures.
What's at stake? What's at stake?
Everything. I mean, I know that sounds vast, but like there every year there's a every year the CDC does a report on teens and teen behavior. They just 6 days ago just released their most recent version, which is now from 2013 to 2023, tracking behaviors over time. And to what's at stake? Well, what's at stake is increased feelings of isolation and loneliness, severe depression, severe anxiety, suicide. I mean, these are not light topics, and don't I don't love bringing them up, but that's what's at stake, right? This what's at stake is the future of connection and humanity. And when we look at the role of I think like what happened in this era of social media was we didn't put people first, and because we didn't put people first, we ended up prioritizing products and prioritizing profit, and that has led to where we are today. And so when we look at this next era and where we're headed with AI, obviously it's a critical technology for our future and has so many implications for our betterment as society. But we also have to put people first and understand what's it going to do to us and how is it going to affect us and how do we make sure we prioritize our connection first before we prioritize the profits and product that is artificial intelligence.
It's, I mean, powerful. This is what I'm grabbing from what you've just talked about. And please correct me, Andrew, that connecting for an organization to connecting more with your population and others is really about selling more. connection with this population is about caring more. How am I doing?
Exactly. Exactly right.
So, what does a brand do who's selling products or an employer that's trying to look for talent? How do they drive greater connection? I'm never going to forget this. And I'm so grateful for what you're teaching us here because there really is a distinction between connecting and connection. What can an organization do to drive greater connection with your generation, Andrew?
Yeah, I appreciate the question because I think it's an important one, and it's one that we believe every organization not only should be asking but needs to be asking. And I think there's three things we think about when we talk about the role that an organization plays. The first is places. How do we actually create physical places for us to show up, right? I mean, we obviously we live in this digitally connected world, and like it's so easy to make a Discord channel and call it your community. But what does it mean to show up in the real world? And how do we create places for people to come together to share around a shared interest for your brand and for your organization, and use that shared interest to drive connection? Right. And so, for example, we've worked with Hinge in the past. Hinge just launched a 1 more hour fund, which is totally separate from the dating world. It's really focused on funding spaces and places that help bring people together over shared interests. And they've donated $1 million over the last year and through this fund to those organizations. That's one example.
I'm
Go ahead.
sorry, really quick.
Yeah.
When you say places and spaces, is this physical places?
It's both, right? I mean, it's yeah, it is critical that there is a physical element involved, but there's also clearly like there's a need to use digital places and spaces to drive to facilitate that, right? It's the idea of how do we use something like a comment section? How do we use a platform like a Partiful or an Eventbrite or these different platforms that drive this to end in the physical connection that happens in places in the real world?
Thank you for
That's part of
clarifying
it.
that.
Yeah, of course, of course. And then kind of the second level here is like programs, which is more about the consistency at which these happen. It's one thing to go and say, hey, we're gonna put together an event and everyone's gonna come to it, but how do we actually drive consistency and important? The reason that's so important is not just because you're consistently showing up as a brand, but it's like what consistency does for a young person is it reduces the mental barriers to going, right? If I know something's happening once and that's the only time, there's a lot of pressure on both how you show up and showing up in itself. And there's so much pressure today in society focused on that we need to consistency allows us to reduce that burden and say, hey, every week on a Tuesday at 6 o'clock after work, we're gonna have this. If you can't make it this week, it's not a problem. Here's the next one, and we're gonna reduce the burden of making sure you're able to come to that by helping show you like what it looks like when you want to that other people have been there, showing you the social proof that it's happened and everything like that. And the final one, which is the last one and most important one, is purpose. And this is, I think, like our big takeaway from doing all of this research. You know, for so long we've talked about sustainability as such a key focus for, hey, the world is Earth is burning. Very true. We need to focus on that as a brand, like obviously critically important. We've talked about, to your first point in the conversation, diversity and belonging and equity and all these important things that are also critical to an organization's success. And so, you know, CEOs, CMOs, all these different people have incorporated that into what they do as a brand. Today, it is a responsibility that brands have and organizations have to make it their purpose to connect people, right? Just as we talk about the world is burning, just as we talk about those other things that's equally important, it needs to be equally as important to connect people. And that is a valid and just cause that every organization can and should have. And that's a responsibility that we believe as young people, as DCDX, that brands should be taking.
You know, Andrew, when I listen to you, and it's so good what you're sharing. But see, organizations have historically, and this is not all organizations, but most, and you just taught me this lesson, is that they've been working to make sure that they're connecting, not driving connection. Because connecting means that I am responsible to you for as long as you buy something from me.
Exactly.
While connection means that you don't have to buy anything from me, but I really want to connect with who you are, with the hopes that if that turns into something that can be commercialized, then that's great. And people must be saying, well, Glenn, you're out of your mind. Business is business, it's about making money. But yeah, but your generation will essentially go dark when and if it wants to.
Right.
And it's how do we always activate you so that you feel that your purpose and sense of belonging is authentic, genuine, and real. And real doesn't mean selling me something. It's, and here comes the question, it means invest in me. So, how would you define how organizations should be answering the question, or let me make sure I got this.
Mhm.
It should be really how can you help them best understand what investing in the Gen Z workforce actually means?
Yeah.
Does that mean programming? Is it what's it mean?
Yeah.
Because based upon the things that you're saying, it requires an investment in really like a real it's a long-term investment. You got to play the long game with this community, not the short game, because they're tired of
Mhm.
that and they can see right through it. That's what I'm getting from this. But
Yeah.
take it away. Sorry about that, Andrew.
No, it's
Get
exactly,
me
I mean,
fired
that,
up.
yeah, it fires me up as well. I mean, it's exactly right. Like it's a long-term investment. I think we get so caught up in just because how fast trends change. And, one day it's Charlie XCX and, it's Brat Summer and the next we're talking about something else. And it's so momentary, the nature of our culture today, that we forget the importance of playing the long game. And when brands decide to exclusively focus on that short term, they lose that long-term purpose. And so while they might gain in those momentary wins, what they lose is the long-term relevance and the long-term sustainability that comes from being a brand that's built for years and not just months. And so when we think about what it means what it means and what it looks like to invest in Gen Z and in that future, it's a two-folded look where we have one part which is like, what are the things that you deeply care about as an audience that won't change, right? We know what those things are. Like those things have been talked about since the dawn of Gen Z being coined. It is sustainability, it is diversity and inclusion, it is a value-led organization. It is in many ways, the convenience and some of the digital native or digital kind of oriented structures that exist. And those things are critical, right? And like if you don't have those, you will lose as a brand and you will fail. But it's also being able to balance that, and this is what is so vastly different today in society for organizations. It's being able to balance that with the quickly changing nature of what is momentary, right? You need to be able to do both to succeed today, and that is a challenge that exists both in a marketing landscape, but also in an organizational one. You need your company and your team needs to be set up in a way to address both of those things. You need to have that long-term vision that commits to who you are, and also be able to jump in and out of those momentary things that make you relevant on a daily basis. And so it's the constant kind of push and pull. I mean, we call it the third law of culture, where it's just, kind of similar to the Newton's third law, where it's like this constant push and pull, this back and forth that exists, but it's the equilibrium that needs to be solved in culture today. And that's what we try and work with brands on consistently.
Well, you just defined the importance of driving harmony between standardization and personalization. We need both of these forces, but unfortunately, they're operating at the extremes because they don't know how to create that equilibrium because they haven't had to. So, with this in mind, let's jump back into the workplace and go a little deeper as we
Okay.
kind of wrap it up here. So, Andrew, I mean, clearly, we've been talking about this indirectly. I mean, clearly, there's an identity crisis at work, and this is making it more difficult for companies to establish their business strategies because they're making assumptions that they have the right talent, let alone the right frame of mind amongst their employees to be able to execute those business plans or those business growth strategies. But yet now we're dealing with multiple generations in the workplace, and people have been talking about this right now. But yet those generations are tired of being defined, and they're
Mm.
not buying what the organization's selling. And now we're talking about not just consumers in the marketplace, but now being employees who are now consumers that have choices and options in the workplace. I mean, this is why we call this personalization outbreak. But this is also why Gen Z workers are tired of being labeled and defined, isn't it?
Yeah. Yeah, totally. Totally. I mean, that's definition in an age of endless options is paralyzing. It's paralyzing. And so, we it's critical to understanding that, like, how to work with young people is understanding that paralysis and being able to simplify and bring about a world where, you don't necessarily need to fit into a mold, one of many molds, to be who you are and who you want to be. You just can be without those things.
It's interesting because you say that and it sounds so ambiguous, but I'm going to give it a shot so that people can truly understand the power of what you just said. And I'm not saying they didn't understand it, but for those that maybe didn't, I often share with leaders and organizations that I work with. That look, I'm not trying through my methodology. I'm not trying to standardize you to think like me. I'm actually trying to do the opposite. And well, how do you do that? I just present them the the concepts within the methodology I've created, and I place a bet on knowing the people that I'm working with well enough to know that they can relate to the content in their own way. And I
Mm.
think this is where it becomes less ambiguous. It's give your people the opportunity to think because they actually do have capacity. Just because you don't see it, because your labels and categories suppress it, doesn't mean it's not in there. You just have to dig deep and rebuild a level of trust for people to then say, hey, someone's actually doing something here with genuine intent, but because it feels so different, it's hard to believe. How am I doing here?
Yeah, I keep going.
Yeah, no, well, I'm just playing off of what
Yeah,
you're saying
yeah,
is that it may sound ambiguous, but it actually isn't. What's ambiguous is to think that if I have a playbook for my employees, that my employees should now have the right to personalize that playbook on their own terms, rather the terms that we prescribed, and then oftentimes make them feel less connected, less trustworthy,
right,
and less then because we have to do things a certain way that may not align with my beliefs and values.
right, right.
So when you hear that, as we wrap it up, what can organizations do with their first of all, I want to know how the organizations and the leaders that are listening to this podcast can get their hands on your research. But can you share whether it's a doesn't matter, it could be a small or large success story on how you've actually helped uh, organizations create meaningful connection with this Gen Z population to help them retain and or recruit top talent.
Yeah, it's a great ending question. I mentioned this earlier, and it's just one of my favorite examples. Our work with Hinge in the past, the dating app. It's a dating app that has quickly become one of the most kind of foundational ways that young people are connecting today in society. And um, our work with them early on was about understanding these barriers that, again, first step in all of this is understanding, right? And so we took the time on our end to say, hey, we're gonna deeply understand the way young daters today are connecting, and we through a variety of different methods and tactics that are kind of these new Gen Z centric ways, we're exploring and getting inside the minds and the lives of young daters today, and really understanding, like, what are some of those barriers that we have to going from connecting to connection, right? To going to really defining that relationship status. And so we, through that process, we helped them Hinge as an organization, both for their marketing and for their programs that they launched thereafter, but also internally. It's been referenced as an onboarding document for the company as well. Like, how do we truly understand what these young daters are going through and their mindsets? And so that's been some of the work we did with them early on that helped them in the future launch programs that have come out of that, such as the One More Hour Fund, which I referenced earlier in the conversation. And I think it's just example, and to your point about investing, right? Like sometimes those investments are the ones that you need to make. While they might seem daunting at the start, and like, there's not an ROI that puts out on a research investigation, but the real ROI is the one that will return year over year over year later when your people, your community are rewarding you for that investment in them.
Can you repeat that last part? When your community
Is rewarding you for the investment in them.
and that's something that standardization has historically not been able to control. And that's the point, is that you can't control everything. It's about letting go and letting the very people that you're serving help shape the brand and where the brand is going. And I think what you just said is powerful, because that was a perfect example of what I believe organizations unknowingly actually miss the point, because they feel that because it's their brand, they're in control, when they're actually not in control at all.
Right.
And this is not just with the Gen Z populations, but all populations that just don't want to be defined by brands anymore. They want to define them.
Right.
Andrew, I'm really so excited about the work that you do. I'd love to stay in touch with you. We got to do a part 2 of this right around this time next year, because the work that you're doing is very meaningful. And I know it takes time. I do. But that's what happens when you're reinventing yourself. I mean, you made it very clear. You have to learn, relearn, unlearn, repeat, repeat, repeat. And in a world of, immediate gratification, it's hard to accept that you're not going to get out in front of the speed of this change unless you continue again to learn, relearn, unlearn, repeat. And that's the investment that you've made for the Gen Z community to help create some solid foundational research to at least get people to start seeing this population, not for what they want to buy, but for who they are as individuals.
Exactly. Well said. Well said.
Andrew, we'll be in touch really soon. And thanks again for all your time.
Thank you so much, Glenn. Appreciate it a lot. Bye-bye.
And as we end every show, when you lead in the age of personalization, you will see things that others don't. Do what others won't, and keep pushing when prudence says quit. Thanks again, Andrew. You are outstanding. Have a great day.
You too.
Thanks for listening to Personalization Outbreak. Make sure to subscribe so you never miss a show. If you enjoyed the content, visit ageofpersonalization.com to check out our free streaming video series and learn how to get involved in the movement. I'm Glenn Llopis. I wish you a good day, and remember, without strategy, change is merely substitution, not evolution.